Hello and welcome to episode 33 of Crime Story Sunday. This episode takes us to the morning of April 26, 1999. And that morning started very normally for one of the UK's highest profile journalists and TV presenters of the 1990s. She ran some errands and then she called at her home. She didn't go home very often because she normally spent her time at her fiancé's house. But this particular morning, she needed to pick up some documents that had been faxed to her by her agent. So she went home. And just after 11:30 a.m. on that spring morning, one shot ended the life of one of the BBC's personalities of the year. This is the unsolved murder of Jill Dando. Jill Dando was born on the 9th of November 1961 in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset in the south of England. She was the daughter of Jack Dando and Winifred Hockey. She had an older sibling, her brother Nigel, who was 9 years older than her. And she had a very uneventful childhood, except for, that is, perhaps the open heart surgery that she had when she was 3 years old. She had a hole in her heart and a blocked pulmonary artery. So in 1965, she survived some adversity. But the rest of her childhood was relatively uneventful. She did well at school. She was a head girl of her sixth form. She completed her A-levels and then went on to study journalism at the South Glamorgan Institute of Higher Education, which is now Cardiff Metropolitan University. She always wanted to work in television. From being a little girl, she would tell people that she wanted to be on the telly. She started off her life kind of small as a journalist for a regional newspaper. Her first job was as a reporter for the Western Mercury, which was a local rag in Weston-super-Mare. Both her brother and her father worked there, so, she was comfortable in that job. But after 5 years as a print journalist, she started to realise her childhood dream of being on TV. And she went to work for the BBC, becoming a newsreader for BBC Radio Devon in 1985. She then transferred to BBC South West, where she presented a regional news programme called Spotlight South West. And then in early 1988, she moved from regional to national television in London to present BBC TV News. Her image at the time was that of a young but perhaps slightly frumpy regional presenter. To her agents and bosses, they felt that perhaps an image overhaul might be useful to Jill. And it's terrible to think that a woman has to think about things like this. But it was all about appearance. Not so much for a guy TV presenter, is it? But for a woman, it's all about appearance. So she was ambitious. So she had a complete makeover, cut her hair into that shorter style that became iconic for Jill. And it was from those humble beginnings that Jill's meteoric rise to being on the TV on a number of very high-profile shows. She went on to present Breakfast Time, the breakfast news on the BBC, the 1 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the travel programme Holiday, and then from 1995 until her death, the crime appeal series Crime Watch. And it was that, upon her death, that people honed in on. Was Crime Watch to blame for Jill Dando's murder? Regarding her personal life, From 1989 to 1996, Jill was in a relationship with BBC executive Bob Wheaton. It was actually Bob who spearheaded the campaign to change Jill's image from a regional presenter to this BBC-style icon. But once she split from him, at the end of 1997, she met a gynecologist, Dr. Alan Farthing, who, in his later career, became Queen Elizabeth II's personal physician. She met him on a blind date set up by a mutual friend. Yeah, they really hit it off. He was separated from his wife due to divorce, and a couple of months after the divorce was finalised, Jill and Alan announced that they were engaged. The wedding was set to take place on the 25th of September 1999. Unfortunately, Jill wouldn't make her wedding. So, as I said in the introduction, Jill spent the majority of her time at Alan's place in Chiswick, and she was in the process of selling her house in Gowan Avenue, number 29 to be exact, in Fulham. She only went home occasionally just to, check on the place, pick up post, and this particular morning, her agent had let her know he'd faxed some documents to her, and she was out and about doing errands. She was at numerous points. She was caught on CCTV in a shopping centre. That's how the cops know she was not followed home, because she was out and about in London. Even back in the 1990s, London was a heavily surveilled city. So they were able to get a really good track of her movements as she went from Chiswick to Fulham. At 11:32 a.m. that spring morning in April 1999, she opened the gate, went down the garden path, and had just reached her front door. She was forced to the ground, and she was shot once to her left temple. 14 minutes later, a neighbour of Jill passed by and saw her lying there in a pool of blood. Paramedics, police rushed to the scene. They tried resus right there on Jill's doorstep, but she was lifeless. Nevertheless, she was taken to a hospital and she was pronounced dead on arrival. So police set about trying to catch this killer. Now, there was only one confirmed sighting of a man that is believed to be Jill Dando's murderer. Her next-door neighbour, Richard Hughes, saw a man about 6 foot tall, white, aged maybe in his 40s, 35 to 45 maybe, walking away from the house. You see, Richard had gone to the window because he thought he heard a scream. Couldn't be sure, and it was just one scream. Interestingly, he didn't hear a gunshot or anything that sounded remotely like a gunshot, and this man just walked away. There were other sightings, maybe, possibly. There was a man at a bus stop who people thought was sweaty and irritated or maybe scared, but he's not thought to be connected with the murder. Interestingly, a postal worker revealed that he delivered mail to Jill's house about an hour before she was murdered, and he'd noticed a dark-haired man in a suit kind of looking at him from across the street. A traffic warden that morning had seen a Range Rover parked illegally on the street, and the traffic warden's just going to give you a ticket and then walk on by. Furthermore, 2 witnesses said that they saw a dark-haired man wearing a jacket running across the road close to Gowan Avenue, and a CCTV camera caught a Range Rover driving at full pelt away from Gowan Avenue about the same time. So there are some intriguing breadcrumbs there. So where did that take the police? Well, not very far. Not very far at all. You see, the police complained that the crime scene had been trampled over. Paramedics had tried their best to save Jill. You know, primarily, it's to save a person, not to protect a crime scene if you're a paramedic. But maybe some clues were lost from that scene. But there was next to nothing to link anybody to the crime scene. There was the bullet. It had gone straight through Jill's head. And there was a shell casing as well. And the bullet was found to have been shot from a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The gun pressed right to her head. Maybe that muffled the shot sound. Maybe a silencer was used. It did look like to ballistics experts that the cartridge appeared to have been modified a little bit, possibly to reduce its charge. The police were under intense scrutiny. Jill Dando was amongst the nation's sweethearts. She was on every other programme. Everybody knew Jill Dando. So just imagine the intensity of that operation that the Met Police had to run. They called their investigation Operation Oxborough. It was utterly fruitless for a year. For a whole year. Within that first year, they'd spoken to over 2,500 people and taken more than 1,000 statements. But still, there was little progress. Until, that is, a man came to their attention. And that man was someone called Barry George. Barry George lived just half a mile away from Jill's house. He was a convicted sex offender. He'd been done for attempted rape in the past. He had a history of stalking women. He was somewhat antisocial and he'd just follow women around. He was a strange guy. He was calling himself with the surname Bulsara and saying that he was a cousin of Freddie Mercury, you know, the singer from Queen. He was in the habit of giving himself kind of false names. He was going under the name of Paul Gadd, I believe, at one point. That's Gary Glitter. Not that you'd want to associate yourself with Gary Glitter these days, however. So he was a strange kind of guy. And they'd had him under surveillance for a little while. And they finally swooped in and arrested him on the 25th of May 2000, so about 13 months after the murder. And he was charged 3 days later with Jill's murder. Barry George was tried at the Old Bailey. The prosecution successfully argued that Barry George was the killer. He was a loner, had previous convictions for attempted rape, although Jill's crime didn't have a sexual element to it at all whatsoever. Shot, point blank range, one bullet, not dragged her in the house and sexually assaulted her, nothing like that. That said, though, he did have some very concerning behaviours. He'd even been arrested in the 1980s in the grounds of Kensington Palace. How he got there, I don't know, but carrying a knife. So, whichever member of the royal family was in residence at Kensington Palace, presumably he was out to get them. And like I said, you know, he was known in the local area for being antisocial and stalking women. And he even had pictures of Jill Dando in his flat. But these were magazines, and Jill Dando was on the cover of all sorts of different magazines. She was a style icon. So, you know, you could probably have gone into anybody's house in the late 1990s and, you know, if they collected magazines or newspapers or anything, they're going to have pictures of Jill Dando. They absolutely are. But there was one little particle that convinced the jury that Barry George was the guy. And it was one particle of gunshot residue in the coat pocket of a 3/4 length coat that resembled the jacket that witnesses had seen the man, the dark-haired man who was around age 40, who was running away, heading away from the murder scene. And forensic specialists believed that that could be residue from the very gun that had killed Jill Dando. And it convinced the jury, and he was convicted. That conviction didn't stick. After 2 unsuccessful appeals and 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally, in 2008, granted a retrial. The particle evidence, 1 particle of gunshot residue, was now deemed inconclusive. The argument being that if he'd really fired the gun, there would have been gunshot residue all over that coat, on the outside of the coat, not just 1 particle in the pocket. And you might say, well, he could have had that coat cleaned and they'd just missed 1 particle. Well, that's true enough. But equally, he lived half a mile away from Jill's house. People were walking down Gowan Avenue, who lived in the local area, to just get a look at the scene. How many people might have walked past Jill Dando's house and picked up a particle of gunshot residue? That ballistics evidence was now inconclusive. Furthermore, a neuropsychiatrist testified that Barry George had an IQ of just 75. So the average IQ is 100, right? So very, very low IQ, making it highly unlikely that he would have had the skill, even if he could have got a gun and, he was seen pictured with a gun in a gas mask and stuff, but he was a weird guy. But being a weird guy doesn't make you a murderer. But this was a clinical killing. The stuff that he'd done in the past was disorganised, was antisocial, was annoying, right? Following women around, taking photographs of them. Annoying, but low level. Yeah, the attempted rape's bad, I get that. But this was a cold, very calculated killing. And the jury acquitted him. And listen, I don't think Barry George was the guy. I think they chose George. He was an easy target. He was a guy that had a lot of problematic behaviours. And then that 1 particle of gunshot residue, well, that was just the cherry on the cake. That was the evidence they needed. But this case to this day has never been solved. And in a BBC documentary about the crime, Detective Campbell, who'd been one of the lead detectives on the case, was asked whether he thought anybody would ever be charged again or go back to court. And he said, do I think somebody will come back to court? Probably not. No. Sometimes I felt we were a day away from solving it. And other times I thought, no, we're a long way away. I think George was an easy guy to pin it on. It nearly stuck, but no, it didn't. But unsolved to this day, there's been a lot of theories. There was an early theory about it being something to do with the Serbians. People thought Jill's murder may have been a retaliation to NATO's actions against media outlets, and there'd been some people killed just days before Jill's murder. Jill had presented an appeal for the Kosovan Albanian refugees just 3 weeks before her murder. The Serbian theory was employed in Barry George's defence when he stood trial in 2001. However, there were other BBC journalists working on the ground in Belgrade at the time, including BBC's World Affairs editor John Simpson, who was another kind of household face all over the news all the time, who weren't killed, who would have been easier targets, obvious targets. And if it was a retaliation, they would have come forward. They'd have wanted people to know what it was a retaliation of, surely. Some people have thought that it was a case of mistaken identity. Some have thought that it was to do with old boyfriends. This is the thing that gets me. She was so rarely at Gowan Avenue. How did that killer know on that day she was going to be there at that time? The only person who knew she was going to be there was her agent, and he was cleared. Proper mystery. What else has there been? Oh yeah, following the Jimmy Savile scandal, a claim was made that Jill had investigated a pedo ring from the BBC, of which there was a pedo ring in the BBC during the mid-1990s, and had handed a dossier containing her findings to BBC management, which the BBC have denied, so that's kind of out there as a possibility. But again, who knew she was going to be there? Who knew she was going to be there? If you can crack that, I think there's a chance of cracking the case. But would there be enough evidence after all this time? I don't know. I don't know, you guys. I don't think this case will ever be solved. So much more to it. So much more out there. You know, but one by one, her agent, her exes were cleared. And the idea that she was murdered because she pissed someone off because of the Crime Watch show, nah, I don't know. So I don't think the Serbs did it. Barry George definitely didn't do it. The pedo ring angle, I don't know. Don't trust the BBC, so I'm open-minded on that one. But you can go down kind of the list of theories and think, no. It all comes down to, in my opinion, who knew she was going to be there that day at that time. And that will lead you to the killer. In my humble opinion, but hey, what do I know? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you heard of this case? In the UK, I know you're going to say yes, but yeah, overseas, I don't know. I don't know how far this case has gone. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.
Okay.